Thanks for joining us over lunchtime today for our 4th online workshop, Balancing Bushfire Safety and Ecological Values, hosted by Perth NRM and the Shire of Mundaring, with funding support from the WA State NRM program. My name is Bonnie Jupp and I work in the Sustainable Agriculture team here at Perth NRM. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are Zooming from today and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging, and acknowledging their spiritual connection to country. So for today's webinar, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box down the bottom and we'll call them out after each presentation. And if we have enough time at the end, we can do some further Q&As if some more questions arise during the session. So we're very pleased to have Rohan Carboon and Dr. Karen Brown from Bushfire Safety Consulting joining us today. Rohan is the Managing Director of Bushfire Safety Consulting and has been consulting in WA since 2009. He has worked on significant state government bushfire risk management projects all around the state and regularly presents information sessions for communities and workplaces. And he's currently a lieutenant at his volunteer bushfire brigade in the Perth Hills. Karen Brown has a PhD in ecology and has worked as a bushfire consultant for the past 5 years. Karen has recently worked with a number of local governments and land care groups in the Perth and Peel region to produce bushfire and ecological risk management plans for high conservation reserves. Karen is also an active volunteer firefighter. So between the both Karen and Rohan, there's a lot of experience and knowledge. So we're very pleased to have both of you here today. We'll kick it off with Rohan first, and then we'll hear from Karen. So take it away, Rohan.
Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks for the opportunity to be involved with this session. I want to stay really focused. We've only got half an hour to talk about an issue we could discuss and dissect and analyse for days. But I'll try and keep really focused to some key points. I first started in the field of community bushfire safety back in 1999, and what surprises me to some degree and doesn't surprise me on others is that the key messages are still similar to what they were 23 years ago. I think it's fundamentally important to plan to be self-reliant when a large landscape scale bushfire is travelling across the landscape. If you're relying on too many people and too many websites and too many mobile phone warnings, they're all weaknesses in the system which can let you down. So I like talking about the large landscape scale fires and the fires that have damaged and destroyed a lot of homes and caused large numbers of fatalities. They're the ones I believe we need to plan for, because they are the ones that have the biggest impact on lives and homes and communities. So that front page there is just me saying we've got to share the risk management of living in a bushfire prone environment. So this is what I want to do in the next 25 minutes. I want to talk about how you go about determining your level of risk. Again, I can only touch on some of the key points, but this is something you need to think about. Where do you live? Where is the vegetation that will burn? How vulnerable is my house? How is my level of fitness? There's all of these factors go into understanding your level of risk, but it is a real personal thing. You might live next door to someone and you think we're exposed to the same level of risk. Now that may not be the case at all. Your house might be 30 or 40 years old, elevated, made of Jarrah weatherboards with timber decks, and your neighbour might be in a brick place on a concrete slab, and they might be 25 years old and you're 65 years old. So your risk is really personal to you. So hopefully my session will give you some ideas about how to determine your own personal level of risk. Now, the three key mitigation strategies I'm really focusing on today, I think, are the three most important. And Karen and I have been consulting for 13 years. So this is what we do every day. We work with clients, groups, communities, and this is how we write our plans. So the first mitigation strategy is actually to have a plan on what you will do when there is a large fire. And you don't just need plan A, you need a contingency, you need a plan B if plan A doesn't happen, you need a plan C. So every bushfire is different. If you've experienced fires in the past, I can guarantee the next one won't be the same. So it is understanding different fires and having contingencies. The one guarantee I think I can make is bushfires in the landscape are inconvenient. They will come at times when you haven't planned for them. They usually turn up at schools at 3:15 when everyone's doing pickups. They happen when you're working down the city and your plan is to be at home and defending your property. So there's all of these contingencies and you need to cover all of them. The other key decision around your plan is to understand the decision you're going to make about whether you're staying to defend your property and under what fire behaviour conditions you'll do that, or is your plan to evacuate? And I call it self-evacuate, because I think it's not a decision we want to rely on government to warn us. We want to have triggers and decisions that help us make decisions if the websites don't work and if the mobile phones don't work. And we've seen that time and time again. Some of these systems fail when there's large threatening bushfires in the landscape. So that's the most important thing you do. One of the other things you can do is influence the fire behaviour around your home. Believe it or not, and you can influence the fire behaviour next to your home by looking at the vegetation that is closest to your home. I'm talking about focusing on what's within 5 metres, what's within 10 metres, 20, 30, 50, 100, but you should focus initially at the vegetation that is closest to your home. Time and time again, Karen and I talk to people and they're more concerned by something 200 or 300 metres away or 5 kilometres away, and they've actually got the biggest problem for their safety of their home and their life is the vegetation that's right up against, under the kitchen window or something. So that's where we'll talk briefly on garden design, garden layout. Karen's going to touch on that in terms of habitat values, but I'll touch on that in terms of just some fundamental fuel management strategies and how do we influence bushfire behaviour in our garden. The third item is the standard of the building that you live in and the design of your home. A lot of people I meet say, my plan is to evacuate. Now, that might work, but we have a problem if it doesn't work, doesn't it? So we could be trapped at home with a large fire, cutting off roads. So I really want you to think about your home as a fire bunker. Your home could be your refuge. And that I think that makes you think about it differently. If your roads were cut off, it was safer to be at your house. It was unsafe to be on the roads driving in fires, which it usually is. That's very dangerous. Your home, then you think about it differently. So I want to give you some skills to identify where is my home vulnerable. What can I do about those vulnerabilities? And some of this is really simple. Some of this is just purchasing basic products from your local hardware store and retrofitting them onto your home to reduce the chance of ignition. So they're my 3 key mitigation strategies. You can let me know at the end whether we get somewhere near you having a better understanding of that. Outside of that, look, other things influence your personal level of risk, the road access, your water supply, whether you've got power and communications. They're probably additional things. And additional things we don't really have time to go on to is your personal your personal health, your fitness, your knowledge of what a fire looks like. Have you fought fires? Have you seen them? Have you experienced them, or haven't you? So there's different vulnerabilities around your knowledge and how good your plan is. So that's just some additional considerations around your risk. So understand your level of risk. I want you to think about what type of bushfire could I experience at my place. And so I'll just lead you through a couple of slides here to get you thinking about this. And what's really important to understand is our knowledge about bushfire behaviour is really well informed by research, but this research is ongoing. So we have the top left picture there is Macarthur, who did a lot of studies back in the 1960s. He did a lot of experimental fires around Canberra, and he developed with others the Macarthur Fire Danger Rating Index, and that became the fire danger rating we've all looked at on the roadsides and on the websites for the last, for my entire life, wherever you're driving through the country. And this system is about to change, but I'll only briefly mention that. A new system comes in tomorrow, and we could spend all session on that, which we won't, but that's interesting. On the right, we've got, I suppose, a typical structure of a dry eucalypt forest or a dry sclerophyll forest. And in terms of fuel for a fire, I want you to think about there's two different components of fuel. One of them's a lot more important than the other. So, and you can think about your garden with this as well. But in a forest and in a garden, you have either fine fuels. Now, fine fuels are the leaves and the twigs and the bark and the branches, the small, skinny, thin branches. The technical definition for dead material is up to 6 millimeters in diameter. On a practical level, it's the material you would grab as kindling to light a fire if you're out camping or you're collecting kindling for your fire at home. So that's the fine fuel. Living fuels also burn in fires, but they're often, well, not often, they have more moisture in them because they're living. So the definition's a little bit different. Maybe they're down to 2 millimeters in size. But if you, when you next walk through the bushland or in your backyard or in your bush area, have a look at the distribution of those fine fuels. The diagram there is just illustrating what we look at when we do fire behaviour modelling. It is not just the quantity, it is not just how many tonnes are sitting on the ground in that surface layer. That's important for low intensity fires, but higher intensity fires start to burn the other levels of fine fuels, the elevated, the intermediate, and then in the canopy. The photo at the bottom, look, it's just the classic one that shows you all of the fine fuels being consumed in a really high intense bushfire. The other factors away from fuel that influence the behaviour of fire is the topography, the steepness or the gradient of the slope. Fires will travel faster upslope than they will on flat ground generally, or downslope for those medium-sized bushfires. And then the third component, which I think we're just starting to understand more about, I mean, a lot of research has now been talking about the influence of the weather or the fire weather. So if we're in a drought situation, the fuels, there's more dead fuels in the environment, the fuels are drier. If the wind is blowing, the wind will carry the flame from fine fuel to fine fuel to fine fuel, like in that bottom photo. So the wind is a massive driver for fire behaviour. I mean, a little tip, I live in the Perth Hills, of course, and if there's ever a fire, like I get a message on my phone or I see smoke, the first thing I do is I walk outside if I'm inside and I look at what the wind is doing. So that's number one. If you have an alert or smell smoke or someone calls you and says there's a fire nearby, find out what the wind is doing because it tells you which way that fire, generally speaking, is going. So what I've noticed recently, particularly in the fire models for forests, is I like this. We're really starting to talk about there are different fires in the landscape, and I like this because often we just use the bushfire as the one thing. It's the one of, it's just a bushfire, but the science is showing these behave very differently. We won't get stuck too much in the detail, but phase one on the left there on that slide is really low intensity, low flame heights, very slow moving. It's really like a prescribed fire or a low intensity or a cool fire that you might deliberately put in the landscape, or might start, in the landscape, maybe even this time of year. There's more moisture still, of course, we're coming out of winter. Phase two starts to consume those more elevated fuels in the forest. You can see the photo at the bottom. The flame heights are, up to maybe 2 to 3 meters high. The intensity is higher. These fires are getting more dangerous. They're burning more fire in the environment. So we need to think about those. And then phase three is extreme fire behaviour, where we really can't directly attack the fire front at all. It's indirect attack and property defence. But phase three fires are interesting to understand because they are the ones that they rarely occur, but they have the biggest impact on homes lost and lives lost. Won't spend much time on this, but what you'll notice tomorrow is we've got a new fire danger rating system coming in tomorrow. So it's a bit ironic that we're running this session. The old system there on the left with the 6 different categories, the new system has 4. Where we were once positioned in what was called the fire danger rating area of Lower West Inland or Lower West Hills, coastal, we've now got a new categories. Now, I won't spend any more time on it, but I want you to look into what this system means for you and where you live and understand the messages. There is going to be, the impression I get, and I've seen it already, is so much information coming around that. Now, Karen and I work on projects where we examine the history of fire weather data. These are just 2 graphs taken from 49 years of the weather station at the airport. 3 p.m, fire danger indices. The general trend for us in the Perth Hills and on the flats is that the fire weather is increasing over time. So regardless of what we do, our risk to large fires, higher intensity, higher frequencies is increasing. And that's borne out from examining the real data over that time. House loss and life loss. It looks a bit complicated, this graph. I've got the 2 different fire danger rating systems there, the old one at the top and the new one starting tomorrow at the bottom. But here's my key takeaways. My key takeaways is, if you look at the bottom line, the fire danger indice, I've drawn a red line where about 50 is. That is in our existing fire danger rating, that's between very high and severe. Now, 3% of homes and lives are lost on days that are up to 50. In the new system, where I can't say that's exactly what high is, but there's 6%. So there's some correlation there. And they account for, 95% of our days through summer. So 95% of our days through summer, not a great level of risk. Let's jump to the other end of the scale where we get to fire danger indice of 100, where that second red line is. This is where we're close to the new catastrophic category, because from here on, we've had the cumulative percentage of house losses at 75% and 60% of fatalities. And there's been, that graph jumps up sort of 3 times. There are 3 big events is between 1926 and 2011, as you can see. So the takeaway is these large fire events have a really big impact. We don't have many of them, but when they do, they are very serious. So please think about how that works, and on the really extreme fire weather days, how you should go about that. House loss, really quickly, we have three main attack mechanisms on a house: embers that blow in front of a fire, radiant heat that, you know, you've all felt that when you've stood around a bonfire, and flame impact. Depending on how close the fuel loads are to your house, the flames can either come from the fire front or they can come from ember ignitions near your house. You know, your garden vegetation burns and then you've got localized flame on your house. The one I want you to focus on is embers, because embers are responsible for about 80% of house ignitions, even in the really big extreme fires. So I like to talk to people about, if we can deal with embers, we're having really big impact on mitigating the threat to our house and the building standards. This just shows you there's been a lot of research into how houses are burnt down in following large landscape scale fires. A lot here I've written along the bottom, which is the classic Western Australian examples in the last 12 years or so. Embers, radiant heat, flames. We have a period of attack before a fire front arrives. We have embers, radiant heat and flames happening as a fire front is around your house. Then the fire front moves and continues moving. We still have ember attack after the fire front has moved on. So I do like you to focus on ember attack. The Australian standards were developed following the big Ash Wednesday fires in '83, and the first is how to build a home to bushfire standards. The first standard focused on ember protection because that research was really clear. Embers are causing problems on home. Embers are entering buildings that are not well sealed, that have gaps on them, and embers are accumulating around the house, in gutters, on doormats, on timber window sills, etc. So the focus on embers is important. How do we deal with that? Well, you can retrofit your home to ember attack. There's a really good publication, The Guide to Retrofit Your Home to Better Protection, and you can just get that free PDF online. So I like to look at my house and look where embers could enter my house, around doors and windows, under roof valleys, under roof ridges, underneath the building if my home is elevated, in vents. So I actually physically identify these vulnerable areas, and then I look at what products can I use to retrofit my home. Now, what we want to do is we want to seal a house down so gaps less than 2 millimeters in size. There's nothing greater than 2 millimeters in size, and most embers are caught in are bigger than 2 millimeters, and they won't go through a 2 millimeter gap. Here's just some photos of jobs I've worked on. Open subfloor spaces. We've used cement sheeting 6 millimeter. You can use mesh material with less than 2 millimeter, masonry steel, L-rated deck material. So you can look at that subfloor space and decks, and there are products. Walls and fascias. The most vulnerable area is where the wall meets the deck or meets the ground level, because this is where embers are accumulating. So we want non-flammable material on the 400 metre vertical and the 300 millimetre vertically out from the horizontally out from the deck. Again, bushfire resisting timber, masonry, cement sheeting. So there are products there. Glass is vulnerable of a house, and plain float glass is good up to about 12.5. The thing that we can do, you know, very expensive to replace your glass for a stronger product glass, is to put screens on the outside, and it can just be simple aluminium powder coated fly wire. If you want to get fancy, you can do stainless steel or brass, but honestly, if you can replace your fiberglass fly wire screens, that will help if you're across both glass pane windows, but at least the openable portion. That helps you. If the window is left open, it obviously filters embers that could get inside. Doors that don't seal well are a bit tricky because there are products like weather strips and seals. Now, some of them are sort of rubber products, so they can burn, but you're better off if you can make the hard surfaces seal together so the gap is less than 2 meters. Adjust your door so you get a really good seal. Vents and weep holes, there are products at every hardware store, mesh products that you can stick in the weep holes. You can replace vents with mesh. These are all the way embers get in. There's your roof ridge and there's under your eaves. So this is steel colour bond. You can use eave linings. Junctions, you can use foil sarking. There are products here to fill in these gaps. You can see how a colour bond roof, the embers slide up under there and you're in your roof space. It's just some work I've done at home. I've lifted off the ridge capping. I've purchased common products, rock wool and earth wool. Either product will do. The rock wool is a little bit better under extreme temperatures. It was harder to install. So I've gone with the glass wool where I own. I just screwed the ridge capping back on top. So that's making my my rooftop in much better condition. So how are lives lost? Look, decisions. This is where the thinking part comes into. What are you going to do? What are my triggers? Where am I vulnerable? And how do I make good decisions? It's now starting to make it's now starting to be more commonly spoken about in the DFES material that's coming out. Outthink the fire. And I couldn't agree with this more. It's so important that if we're panicking, we're making bad decisions. So it's early decisions, having clear triggers. I'll show you what my plan is at the end. That's what we'll finish up on. Just a little bit on gardens and vegetation around homes. I've done an experiment in my backyard, just where I gathered some handfuls of the grass tree skirts that were just laying around. I found on the ground, and I used the same quantity of grass tree skirt. I've just called it 2 handfuls. And I've lit that on the ground there. I've got my teenage daughter there to hold up. That was a good use of her there, hold up the staff to measure how high. So when it was all on the ground level, we had a flame height of about 1.5 metres. When I halved it and put one bit of fine fuel at a metre and half the fuel at the ground, we then had a 2.8 metre flame height. Same amount of fuel when we put it in thirds. You can see I'm just structuring the fine fuels here. We had 4 to 5 metre flame height. The same amount of fuel in these 3 experiments, but they're all behaving completely different. So this is when you look at your garden, look at the fine fuel arrangement. Do we have this connected, elevated, aerated arrangement of fine fuels in the vegetation? And then I did half the amount of fuel and layered it in 3 layers, elevated, and we still had 2.5 metre flame heights. So I compared double the fuel on the ground to half the fuel arranged, elevated, and the flame height was nearly double for the half the quantity, but it was elevated. So your garden design, think about fine fuels, heavy fuels in your garden. How can I separate my fine fuels so I don't provide these connections? Garden design is I think the best gardens I've seen, and what I'm trying to replicate at my own house, is providing these gaps with landscape materials and features, rock walls, corrugated iron, steel, concrete, mesh. I'm trying to use these materials which won't burn to take up. Embers can, vegetation can filter embers, and it's not an exact science, but vegetation that's well watered, separated from your house, can provide you protection from radiant heat, can filter out embers, can deflect wind. It's probably on a site-by-site assessment. Now, a lot of people get very interested in plant flammability. Now, plant flammability is a complex area to examine, because we might grow the same plant at your place and my place, but I might water mine more, so my flammability of the same plant could be completely different to yours, which is on the north side in the sun and it dries out through January, February. So plant flammability is impacted by moisture level, oil content, which a lot of our Myrtaceae plants have, natives, the bark type arrangement, how fine the leaf areas are, and how much dead material they retain. So I certainly think it's good to feed plants out to work out how flammable they are, but I don't like the idea that plants can be fire retardant. Everything will burn. I think these are 4 good examples of gardens which use landscape materials to break up the garden beds, and they show that we're separating and isolating our fuel loads. We're using rock material there. We've got the grass tree skirts pruned off there. We're using, you know, that rusted iron in the top left, and probably corrugated iron over in the right. But when I meet people and they ask what type of garden, I try and direct them to make garden beds and use non-combustible materials around them. Something that you can find online if you're interested is regarding your water supply and access. I won't go into detail here, but if you wanted a fire truck to access your property to help defend it, there are certainly standards that you can see. We're nearly at the end. Here's the last bit that I want to talk about, because it's the most important. It's the plan you have to evacuate or to stay and defend your property. These are decisions you need to make with your family, and you need to have, as I mentioned at the start, plan A, plan B, plan C. If the plan involves the fit, active 25-year-old son to start the pump and to put out the embers, but they happen to be working on a mine up in the Pilbara, or they're working down in the city, then that plan fails. So make sure you have all your contingencies covered. The thing that's really important here is you may have a plan to stay and actively defend, but I want you to think about how big is this fire. If this is in the extreme end, then there is serious risk of injury and death. Through staying and defending, I can't emphasize enough that I think staying and defending under extreme conditions is really for people who have experienced large bushfires and they know what to expect. The trigger to leave, this is important. How do I make decisions to leave my property? We're just about finished. This is my personal bushfire survival plan. As you can see, I live just in Chidlow, or just on the edge of Chidlow. I've got a bush reserve over the road. This is an AO poster. This is a huge poster we have on the wall. And my kids use this plan. They've used it for 10 years. So I'm involving the whole family, my wife, my kids, and myself. So everyone can use it depending on who's home. But it's just an aerial photo of 10 kilometres around my property. I record what the fire weather conditions are. It gives me an idea of what the risk of a large fire is. When there is a fire, this is a big laminated plan. We just mark on where it is. And if the kids are there, I'll say, go outside and tell me which way the wind is blowing. So here's a real fire back in 2016, I think. So this was, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometres from my house out to the east. Wind blew from the north, and then it blew from the northwest. They actually closed the Great Eastern Highway there for a short period of time. By doing this simple example, I could answer that fundamental question. The fundamental question is, will or could, I like the word could that fire threaten my house or my family or my life? That's a question I always ask when there's a fire. And I use, look, a bit of a flow chart over here on the left. By asking that question, examining where's the fire, which way is the wind blowing, how far away is it, where is it predicted to go under those wind conditions, it's either going to threaten me or could threaten me, or it won't. Now, if it could or it is, then that's my trigger to self-evacuate my house. I'm on a 10-year program to prepare my house. I'm only halfway through it, so I'm not staying to defend it under extreme conditions, so we move. So there's only two safe responses: evacuating early from a fire or staying to defend a really well-prepared house with all of the equipment. So let's use that to make decisions. You know, there's my house plan and the checklist for everyone to do. There's all my emergency contact numbers. We won't really go through this, but this is sort of saying, where is the fire? Could it threaten us? Get everyone together, make a decision. That's what that says. Here's my take-home messages. I think I've gone over time. Think about how you can assess your own house. Get help from a professional if you need to. Consider getting a BAL assessment done. Anyone can get a BAL assessment done. You can buy the standard yourself and try and do an assessment yourself. That way you're learning about your risk. Assess your garden for fine fuels and continuous fire runs. Consider your age, your health, your mental preparation, your experience, your knowledge of fire, access and water supply. Focus on these mitigation strategies. These are the three ones we've been through. Have a plan A, B, C and D if you need. Clear triggers to evacuate, places to shelter. Monitor for fire on those extreme days that we know we have the biggest problems. Look at your garden, assess where the fine fuels are. So that's number two. And what vegetation to plant next to your house. Retrofit using cheap products. And that's what I'd like to leave you with. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Rohan. That was really informative. I appreciate the insights you gave and just all those mitigation strategies, and also, you know, the housing solutions and the Firewise garden solutions as well. Yeah, it's really practical, and I think, yeah, we can all do some reflecting after this and get a plan together. So yeah, really appreciate that. Yeah, I guess it's open for questions now. I just wanted to remind everyone that you can pop a question down in the Q&A box, which is down the bottom. There's like a little window that says Q&A. So if you've got any questions for Rohan specifically, you can add them in now, but we will have some time at the end to do some more Q&As if you think of anything from now on. I just had one question about bushfire sprinklers. How effective are they?
Yeah. So, Bonnie, they can be very effective, but they have to be well designed and independent of power supply going off, and the piping needs to be, you know, copper or steel piping where it's exposed. So the pump needs to be protected. I've seen many bushfire sprinkler systems, and the bushfires are good at finding the weakest link. So if your pump is out beside your tank and it's got leaf litter around it, well, the fire will knock out your pump and the whole system's down. So you need to protect the infrastructure. In terms of where you need to spray water, a lot of people waste water in places they don't need to spray it. You need to spray it where the house is vulnerable. Windows, glass, timber frames around your doors and your windows, under the eaves, so it needs to be where embers are going to accumulate. Yes, in the gutters and the roof valleys, but you don't need to spray a lot of Colorbond roof. It's pretty solid. So the system needs to think about the vulnerabilities, where water is, how much water have I got, how do I activate the system if I'm there, if I'm not there. They can be really well done. Most are very poorly done. But Google bushfire spray standard. There's an Australian standard. Get hold of that standard and have a read.
Okay, no worries. Thanks for that. And another one that just came to mind as well was about the new fire danger system coming in tomorrow. So will there be a specific website? Was that on the DFES website where we can find that?
Yeah.
Remind everyone.
There's quite a look. It's like everything, isn't it? There will be a lot of information on their website, but you will need to look for it, I think. I think there'll be a bit of media attention tomorrow because it starts September 1. It's a much improved system, but we've got to get used to it because we've been looking at these other boards for years and we sort of work them out now. So the new system has similarities, but it's based a lot more. It's based a lot more on the science of bushfire behaviour. There's 8 different fire models rather than 2. So it will be in a different zone. So I just encourage people to actively search out the information. If you do that, you will find heaps. Yeah.
Yep. Very good. Okay, well, there's no questions in the chat box at the moment, so we might hand over to Dr. Karen Brown to present, and then if any more questions come through, we can go through them at the end. So I'll now like to hand it over to Karen.
So Rohan's just been talking about the latest research into the most effective ways to reduce bushfire risk. And I'm going to talk about how we can balance those bushfire mitigation priorities while also protecting ecological values. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how native ecosystems respond to fire and how also how changes in the last 200 years or so since colonisation can impact the recovery of native ecosystems. I'll talk about what we know about the optimal fire regimes, and also pros and cons of hazard reduction burning for bushfire protection and how you can apply this as a tool. And finally, I'll talk about how ecological values can be incorporated into your asset protection zone. The fire is a disturbance that's been a part of the Australian landscape for a long time. About 100 million years ago, Australia was connected to Antarctica at a more southern latitude, with much of the continent covered in this cool, temperate, rainforest-like vegetation. Australia's gradually drifted north away from Antarctica and the climate's become warmer and drier. The temperate rainforests were replaced in many areas by eucalyptus forests and other drought-tolerant vegetation types. A Mediterranean climate was established in the southwest about 2.5 to 5 million years ago, and this has resulted in cool, wet winters and the hot, dry summers that we still experience today. This climate promotes vegetation growth during the cooler, wetter months, and then conditions which are conducive to that vegetation burning in the hotter, drier months. So Indigenous people are believed to have been present in the southwest from about 50,000 years ago. They developed a system of land management using fire for activities such as hunting and promoting the growth of food and medicine plants, and for moving more easily through the landscape. Fire was used to encourage the desired vegetation structure. So, for example, in some areas in the southwest, they were believed to have been burnt very frequently, about every 2 to 4 years, to promote lush, grassy-like woodlands. Other areas were burnt less often, but for specific purposes, such as to encourage thickets with straight branches for spear making, while other areas were left and they generally only burnt as a result of lightning or accidental ignition. So it's not surprising that most species found in the southwest have developed strategies to recover from fire, at least to some extent, although there are some exceptions to this, including places like granite outcrops and peat swamps that don't generally see fire much. Many species have evolved to take advantage of reduced competition and increased resources that are available after a fire, and they respond well, while others are found to be more likely in areas that have been unburnt for some time. So there's a number of ways that species can respond to fire. And many plants are stimulated to flower after a fire, and others release seed. Sometimes this seed has been released prior to the burn and is stored in the soil, and the soil protects it from the heat. And others hold their seed in cones on the plants, which the death of the plant or the heat of the fire cracks open and releases after a fire. There's some species that are generally killed by fires, and they rely solely on this seed being released and germinating for regeneration. and those plants are called obligate feeders. Plants can also resprout from lignotubers. They have stored starches which can promote rapid leaf growth after a fire, and these lignotubers are generally protected by the soil and sprout from the base or from bark on trunks of trees, and the bark protects them from the heat of the fire. So the increased leaf growth and nectar and seeds is an increased source of food for many animal species, and they can benefit from this. And also some native species can have increased hunting success as there's less cover around for their prey to hide in. The benefits of some fire can be complicated for species though. Here's some examples of species that have been shown to benefit from fire. To the left is the grass tree or the balga, which is flowering. It's quite famous for flowering after fire. Up the top, you see lignotubers sprouting from under the bark of the tree, the eucalyptus tree. Some of the species that benefit from fire include the white-cheeked honeyeater, the increased nectar sources, birds of prey like the wedge-tailed eagle and goannas. Down at the bottom right-hand side is a picture of the jarrah understory. It contains a high proportion of obligate feeders, so plants that are killed by fire and then regenerate from seed after the fire. So the benefits of fire can be complicated. For example, these understory shrubs, they can start to thin out and become less abundant as time since fire increases, but they regenerate well after fire through this soil or cone stored seed. But they need to germinate, flower and produce sufficient seed before another fire comes through, or else they can decline or even become locally extinct from an area. So while fire can be beneficial to these species, too frequent fire is detrimental. And some species, such as the choke and the quenda, shown up on the top right, have been observed utilising areas soon after a fire. However, they need that dense understory habitat in nearby unburnt areas to breed and shelter from predators. So the small patchy fires can provide increased food sources. However, loss of habitat over large distances can make them more vulnerable to predators. So some animals have been found to require mature plant structure and cover for protection or food, and are more likely to be found in those areas that have experienced a fire some time ago. For example, the critically endangered ringtail possum, shown up on the top left, is found to be more abundant in areas that haven't been burnt for 20 years or more. And this is due to an increase in refuge and nesting sites as well as food sources. Maximum seed production in Banksy is not reached until sometime after fire, in 20 to 30 years after a fire. And so this can be important for the number of threatened cockatoos that an area can support. And likewise, maximum nectar in some plants isn't reached until many years after first flowering. And this can be important for the density of nectar feeding animals such as the honey possum and honey eaters. The western spinebill, as well as the splendid fairy wren, which is shown up the top there, they've been found to be more abundant in areas with a longer time since last burn. And there's a species of insect, a type of hermitron bird, that's only found in the dead thatch of grass trees. And this type of habitat is generally removed after a fire and takes some time to re-establish. Other species found associated with longer unburnt vegetation include the turtle frog, shown up on the top right there, as well as the western banjo frog and the squelching froglet. The common dwarf skink, which is pictured down the bottom there, is also found to be more abundant in longer unburnt areas. A study into the fire responses of reptiles in Banksy woodlands on the Swan coastal plain found that rarer species of reptiles tended to be more associated with the longer unburnt sites. And other researchers found that these longer unburnt sites were underrepresented in the landscape for this vegetation type. And finally, some animals feed largely in the decomposting riverbeds and associated fungi and soil invertebrates, and this can take some time to develop after fire as well. Not a lot is known about fire response of fungi, but it's thought that there are species that are associated with longer unburnt vegetation. So hollows in trees and logs are an important habitat feature of bushland areas. They can be important for things like threatened cockatoos and ringtail possums. The research is not comprehensive, but it generally shows that they're more abundant in the underground vegetation. Overall, more research into complex interactions between species and ecosystem responses to fire is required. So most of the existing studies is on plants and vertebrates, and very little is known about invertebrates, which make up 97% of the faunal diversity. And fungi is also underrepresented, despite being known to be highly diverse as well. So native species are not very well adapted to respond to many of the new disturbances that have occurred in the last 200 years or so. And just one of the impacts of these disturbances is on native vegetation and native ecosystem in general, regeneration after fire. So introduced predators such as cats and foxes can predate on small native animals, which is a greater issue after fire due to the reduced plant cover for small animals to hide. Removal of the leaf litter as a result of fire can also result in the germination of weed seeds that were previously present but prevented from germinating due to the thick leaf layer, or else they can spread from nearby areas. And weeds by their nature outcompete native plants and can significantly affect their regeneration after fire. And two examples shown there in the pictures, the Sydney golden wattle and the African lovegrass, which are widespread in the southwest and respond very well to fire. Another disturbance includes rabbits that graze the last new regrowth after fire and can significantly impact regeneration. Down on the bottom left, the dead trees show vegetation that's affected by Dieback disease. The dieback is an introduced pathogen that results in root rot and kills many native plants, including jarrah, Banksy and balga or grass trees. Up to 40% of species in the southwest are affected by dieback, and it's estimated that approximately half of all endangered plants in the southwest are affected. Not a lot is known about the interaction of dieback with fire, but some studies show that it can increase the susceptibility, likely by opening up the soil and weakening the plants so that they're less able to resist infection and so that it can spread more easily. Areas that are currently infected are likely to be significantly more impacted by fire as the plants have reduced reserves to call upon in order to regenerate. So altered fire regimes as a result in changed land management over the last 200 years is listed as a threatening process for the vast majority of threatened species and ecosystems in the southwest. This is most commonly due to an increase in fire frequency in the southwest. There are some ecosystems, particularly in Eastern Australia, and they usually tend to be eucalypt woodlands with native grassy understories. And these require regular fire to maintain ecosystem health, and the decline in that fire has resulted in the decline of the ecosystem. So the bottom right picture shows the widespread structure of the southwest forest prior to logging that was undertaken in the last century. If you look carefully, you may be able to see some people on horseback at the base of the trees, just to give you a scale of the size of the trees that we've effectively lost. So many forests are much more flammable and more prone to high intensity fire today as a result of the dense sapling and shrubbery growth as a result of this forestry. And finally, the rainfall in the southwest has been decreasing over the last 50 years, and the number of heat waves has increased, and this can significantly impact the regeneration of native species. For example, plants can take longer to reach maturity and produce seed, and this can increase the time required between fires for successful regeneration. An important ecological value to protect in native bushland areas is ecosystem resilience to these disturbances. So it's important to recognise the conservation importance of areas that are relatively weed-free and not infested with dieback disease, for example. So different assemblages of species, which are known as ecosystems, can respond very differently to fire overall. Fire regimes are usually talked about in terms of prescribed burning or adding controlled fire to the landscape for bushfire protection or ecological objectives. No one optimal fire regime is suitable for all species and all ecosystems. Therefore, the best approach to conserve biodiversity in the landscape is to maintain a diversity of different fire vegetation ages within the landscape, So you can think of it as a diversity, you can think of diversity as a continuum over time after fire, not just spatial diversity. Different ecosystems have different species which require different amounts of time to recover after a fire. A minimum fire interval is the amount of time required after a fire for an ecosystem to recover to a point where it's unlikely to be negatively affected by the next fire. The high degree of diversity and complexity of ecosystems means that information used to determine minimum fire frequencies is nowhere near complete. In addition, the presence of other disturbances, such as weeds and dieback and reduced rainfall, can complicate things even more. The current minimum fire interval determinations for different ecosystems are mostly based on plants. The best estimate for determining optimal fire regimes is based on current knowledge of the plant juvenile period. So juvenile period is the amount of time it takes for a plant species present at the site to regenerate and mature after a fire. The longest juvenile periods in plants usually occur in those that are killed by the fire and regenerate by seed. They need to grow to maturity, be able to flower and produce more seed before the next fire comes through, or there's a high probability that they can decline or become locally extinct from an area. However, not all plants currently have known juvenile periods. The widely accepted minimum fire frequency is given as 2 to 3 or 4 times the longest known juvenile period for a species that occurs within a given plant community. It was initially given as 2 times, as this was thought to allow obligate cedar plants to build up enough seed stores to survive the next fire. However, recently it's been recommended to extend this to 3 or 4 times, particularly for high conservation value sites, to take into account reducing rainfall and increasing temperatures, as well as other disturbances facing native ecosystems. So here's just some examples of the recommended minimum fire frequencies for balancing high conservation values with bushfire protection at some sites that we've recently assessed. They can vary significantly from site to site, depending on factors such as intensity and timing of previous fire, variations in the canopy and understory species, and amount of disturbance present. It may be considered important to burn more frequently closer to homes to reduce bushfire risk and sacrifice some ecological values, and vice versa. It's important to remember that vegetation with time since last fire longer than the minimum fire frequency is still important in the landscape for conservation, particularly for native fauna. It's also interesting to note that Tuart, Banksy and Woodlands are all killed by high intensity fire, and regeneration is significantly more successful after a high intensity fire. And this is because often a lot of seed is released after a high intensity fire, and there's improved germination of the seed in the presence of the nutrient-rich ash beds that are generated. The hazard reduction burning is a prescribed burn in controlled conditions, specifically to reduce the amount of fine fuels in the ground and near surface layers. Reducing the fine fuels can reduce a bushfire speed and intensity, and it can significantly improve the likelihood of fire suppression, mostly in those bushfires that occur in the lower 95% of the fire danger index conditions. And this is the vast majority of fire weather conditions that brigades will attend in. Bushfires are unlikely to be suppressed during extreme fire weather conditions in an area that has had a recent hazard reduction burning. However, the fire intensity can be reduced, and this may assist in asset defence or potentially save lives when close to home. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of hazard reduction burning drops off quite quickly. This is because the leaf litter and twigs and other dead plant matter starts to reaccumulate at a fast rate. Previous research has found it to be effective for up to 8 years since last fire, and in some studies, less than 2 years in extreme conditions. Hazard reduction burning is not very effective for fire suppression or protecting homes in those really extreme fire weather conditions. While these conditions don't occur very often, when they do occur, that's when most homes and lives are lost. Hazard reduction burning can have detrimental effects on ecosystems as well, usually as a result of increased weed and dieback spread and also increased introduced animal impacts. It also results in an increase in fire frequency in the landscape, which may impact some species. This can occur if the hazard reduction burning in some areas is conducted too frequently, but also if a bushfire occurs soon after a hazard reduction burn, it may result in greater damage to the ecological values than just the bushfire alone would have. So the trees may be less affected in that case, as the fire is likely to be lower in intensity. However, it could be detrimental to the health of understory species that have not yet recovered from the hazard reduction burn and can even lead to local extinction. So hazard reduction burning can be a useful tool in the toolbox, but bushfire mitigation has its limitations, and this needs to be taken into account. So these graphs show how fuel loads build up in a jarrah forest. They're taken by a PhD by Neil Burrows. The left graph shows the build up of leaf litter. The top line is for higher rainfall jarrah sites, greater than 950 millimetres, or the lower line, which is a bit faint, sorry, that's for the 750 to 800 millimetre rainfall jarrah sites. So as you can see, the leaf litter rises rapidly initially, and then it starts to plateau at around 10 to 15 years. And this is when the decomposition rates start to approach the litter accumulation rates. The graph on the top right shows the quantity of large shrubs, or the elevated fuel layer, and it shows it initially increasing after a fire and then starting to decrease as a result of old age and senescence. Some recent research found that longer unburnt sites greater than 43 to 56 years since last fire were less likely to burn in a bushfire in the southwest, although this study is hotly contested at the moment. The research postulates that self-thinning of saplings and large shrubs in a forest as it matures reduces the fire risk, with the most flammable stage of a forest being between 20 and 30 years post-fire. The bottom right graph shows the composition of surface fuels after a fire. The leaf litter is shown in blue, and it starts accumulating soon after a fire, initially making up the greatest proportion of the surface fuels. The duff, which is shown in orange, is a compacted leaf layer below the surface leaves, and it's usually in varying stages of decay. After around 4 years, when the leaf litter starts to connect, the duff layer then starts to increase in depth and proportion over time until it reaches a steady state. The depth of the loose leaves on the surface remains relatively constant from this point on. And the woody material, such as twigs and cones, gradually increases over time. This just shows you the fuel accumulation curve in Banksy Woodlands, and you see a similar pattern with rapid initial increase in fuel loads, plateauing out this time much earlier at 4 to 6 years post-fire. So based on all this knowledge, how can we get the most out of hazard reduction burning while protecting ecological values? We can prioritise areas close to homes and other assets, as well as driveways and access routes. Strategic fire breaks are where the topography and access means a fire could be suppressed by firefighters, and this is another good area to target. And also areas that tend to have a large number of ignitions, usually as a result of arson. We can also maintain some areas with longer time since last fire where possible, but away from high-risk areas close to homes and escape routes. Where hazard reduction burning is identified as a useful tool, conducting the burn carefully with ecological values in mind can help preserve them. So ecological burning is usually done at low intensity and at a small scale, so that a patchwork mosaic of areas with different times since last fire develops in the landscape. And this can include areas left unburnt in appropriate locations where possible. Low intensity burning, which is done with the protection of ecological values in mind, can be labour intensive and time consuming. Minimal ignition points prevent fire from getting too intense, but then it takes longer for an area to be treated. However, these smaller areas allows for greater recolonisation from surrounding areas, and it's also more manageable for the monitoring and treatment of weeds. Important habitat trees and logs to be protected by raking around them prior to the burn. Habitat trees contain hollows or have the potential to form hollows and can be identified as any tree over 50 centimetres in diameter at chest height or over 30 centimetres in wandoo. Late autumn or early burning after the rains have started is best for optimising native vegetation regeneration, as well as for protecting orchids and other native annuals. Spring burns can reduce native seed germination and survival over the long hot summer that follows. And it can also impact on many species of birds and other animals that are breeding at that time of year. It's important to note that these principles align with many of the characteristics of cultural burning by Indigenous people. So here's an example of a cool low intensity burn. You can see that the habitat tree is being raked around to protect it from the fire. Here, it's hard to burn cool under large shrubs sometimes, but it can be done in the right conditions, particularly by removing dead branches and other plant material from underneath and installing some raked breaks around it if required. And you can also use a hose to just cool down as the fire trickles underneath it. High intensity fire can kill the large shrubs and actually lead to dead standing elevated fuels, which can increase bushfire risk. It can also lead to the dense germination of eucalyptus, parrot bush and other large shrubs, which can increase bushfire risk. The dead branches and other plant materials can be piled up in open areas where the higher intensity flames can't kill the shrubs or scorch canopies. You can just see here a small patch of branches that had been pulled out from underneath that shrub and that the fire intensity flares up there. Some patches of high heat within the burn may help the seed of some species of native plants in the soil bank to germinate. So this photo shows a large pile of branches pulled out into the open from underneath the trees behind it, and this allowed a cool burn to trickle underneath those trees. It's quite a disturbed site, and it's hoped that this patch of high intensity fire might help to germinate some seed in the soil bank. There's planned ongoing weed management before and after the fire, which will also help regeneration. They've set up some quadrats at this site to monitor the results to inform future management actions and to increase our knowledge to be able to apply to other sites. Effectively observing the impact of any management actions or even inaction can be really important for improving conservation efforts in the future. So another important ecological feature of bushland is the dead thatch in the skirts of grass trees or alga. They are an important habitat for a wide diversity of small native animals such as quenda, ringtail possums, phascidales, honey possums, microbats and small birds. A minimum of 25% of grass tree skirts should be retained where possible whenever hazard reduction burning is undertaken. Grass trees taller than 1 metre in height, those with multiple heads, or those with obvious signs of animal activity should be prioritised for retaining. New growth and post-burn flowering can drain the grass tree reserves, so it's important not to burn more frequently than every 6 years. It can take at least 5 years after a fire for the skirt to start to have important habitat value again. There is a perception that grass trees need to be burnt, or else the weight of the skirt can weigh it down and kill it. However, while this occasionally occurs, it's generally not thought to be very common. So this just shows some grass trees with important habitat value. The one on the left shows the activity of quenda diggings, so that shows that grass tree has high importance. And also to the grass tree on the right, it can be hard to see, but down the bottom there's a little tunnel into the skirt and the little paths in the vegetation running up to it, showing that it's well used by native animals. And this just shows a close-up of the little tunnel under the grass tree skirt that native animals use. The DFIS have put out a good information sheet on the threat that dead grass tree skirts can pose close to buildings, but it balances that with their high habitat value away from buildings. It also provides directions on the best way to burn grass trees to maintain their health if required. So removing weeds from bushland can sometimes have a significant reduction in bushfire fuel structure and therefore bushfire hazard. In particular, the woody weeds, such as this eastern states wattle, can increase the elevated fuel layer, which then increases the fire intensity and the potential for canopy fire. Introduced grasses and bulbs can increase the fire's rate of spread, which results in a fire moving much more quickly than it would through the native understory alone. Weed growth after hazard reduction burning can sometimes result in an overall increase in bushfire risk of an area. Another good way to reduce bushfire risk is by encouraging quenda numbers. They can improve the health of bushland as well as help to reduce bushfire fuels. Their diggings create little patches of bare earth. And a recent study has shown that areas fenced off from quenda activity had significantly higher fuel loads than areas where the quenda were foraging. So the blue dots show areas that were fenced off from the quenda and didn't have any quenda activity, whereas the orange dots where the quenda were actively foraging. So it's quite a significant reduction in fuel loads. So Rohan's talked previously about the importance of asset protection zones for bushfire protection. Many high ecological values can be retained or even added to an asset protection zone while managing it primarily for reducing bushfire risk. They can contain native plants, but they should be kept clear of dead leaves, twigs, thatch, branches, and other fine fuels. Like any other plants in the asset protection zone, they should be separated into small clumps. And think carefully about native plant selection in this zone, particularly up close to the house. And there's lots of resources out there to be able to help with this. Fuel layers should be separated in the asset protection zone. So, for example, no large shrubs under trees. No large shrubs should be planted close to the building either. In general, the rule is to plant a plant at least 3 times the mature height of the plant from the building. So large shrubs separated by non-combustible parts and not under trees can be a part of the APZ at least 10 metres away from the house. And these large shrubs can provide good habitat for many species, such as the small birds that need it for refuge and nesting sites. But they will still utilise the more open areas of the asset protection zone if they've got that habitat nearby. Native trees can be retained in the APZ if the canopies are widely spaced and not overhanging the house. Removing the lower branches of the tree from 2 to 2 metres from ground level can help to stop fire from getting up into the canopy and ensure that there's no shrubs again underneath the trees. You can have low ground covers underneath the trees, but you'll need to remove the leaves that get caught in them regularly, and this can be difficult, especially under eucalypts. So it's important to consider your maintenance ability and your commitment. So this is a photo of my garden, which we've established over the last 10 years on what was a paddock, and we've got bushland in the background there. We've located the low fuel areas close to the home, include things like non-flammable paths, lawn, pool, veg garden, car parks, etc. Sheds, wood storage shelters and other flammable structures should be at least 6 metres from buildings if possible. No gardens or mulch or that sort of thing should be directly adjacent to the house. So I've got succulents in the pots along the house there, but I keep them well watered in summer and clear of dead plant materials and leaves and things like that, and the succulents are less likely to burn. We've planted a few deciduous trees for shade close to the house. We've got lots of low native ground covers and shrubs and kangaroo paws and the like, which we get lots of birds and quenda and lizards utilising all the time. Providing a water source during summer can be beneficial to birds and other animals close to homes. So coming from a fairly degraded environment, I've been able to improve the ecological values of my property while maintaining an acceptable risk from bushfire. However, there will be some impact to ecological values in the asset protection zone if you're establishing one in bushland. However, it can be minimised by following these principles. So this is a bit further away from my house. Got more larger shrubs, which are used good habitat for small birds that they nest in. We also get carnivorous cockatoos coming in and feeding on the hay shears at the back there. The rock features provide good non-combustible habitat for small animals such as quenda and goannas. There's lots of little tunnels buried underneath them. And we've left separation between our garden and the bushland behind. We've left a fire break there as well to help separate the fuels. A large non-combustible path big enough for our fire appliances runs through the middle of our garden, and there's smaller paths scattered throughout to break up the clumps of natives as well. It's just an example of some of the smaller paths that break up the clumps of natives. The large shrubs at the back there are located more than 10 metres from the house. So many native animals like to have cover nearby, but will regularly utilise the surrounding open spaces. So this means by creating a bit of space around your house and the habitat in the garden, you will have a good chance of being able to closely observe the wildlife that it supports. And here's a couple of photos of the increasing number of wildlife that we see all the time utilising our garden. We actually had a echidna a couple of months ago. It was at dusk and I couldn't get a good photo of it. But yeah, seeing lots and lots more wildlife since the garden's been established. So take-home messages. There are many different effective tools for reducing a bushfire risk. And it's important to remember that preparing a home and your asset protection zone is very important. Fuel management can be important in strategic areas, but you can balance it with ecological considerations. Ecology is complex though, and responses to fire vary significantly. Weeds, dieback, introduced animals, and a dry and warming climate complicates things further. We do know that longer unburnt vegetation is important for some ecological values, and we also know that the location of that longer unburnt vegetation is important for bushfire protection outcomes. We need to develop site-specific and strategic solutions to mitigate bushfire risk while protecting our ecological values. Hopefully today we've given you some information and tools to be able to do that. We do need more research to better understand these issues and to see improvements in the future. Finally, it's important to remember that given that this is a very complex and dynamic area, we can continue to learn ourselves and observe our results, and this can better inform our future action.
Thank you, Karen. It was very insightful, and yeah, I guess our ecosystems are very complex, and it was great to understand that relationship like our native flora and fauna has with fires, and how we can balance that, having a good ecological impact but also reducing our bushfire risk as well. So thank you so much for that. If anyone did have any questions, there's still some time to pop the questions down in the chat, but I've just got a couple for you, Karen. So I was wondering, does mosaic burning provide the best ecological outcomes?
I think it can. It's good to have the different ages in the landscape. I think one thing that's often missing is an area, if possible, sometimes it's not possible, but having areas where you do have those longer unburnt vegetation. But yeah, in general, breaking it up into mosaics is a good way to go.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the information about burning grass trees. Can we share that with the participants? Is that
as in the best way to burn it?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, because there is a technique which can help protect them during the burn. Basically, we don't want it to get too intense. If you kill the apical bud, which is at the top, then the grass tree can die. So you want to make sure that that's protected from too much heat. The best way to do that, if it hasn't been burnt in such a long time, it's a really big one, you're better off cutting away some of that thatch first so that it doesn't get too intense. And apart from that, starting at single ignition only, so don't walk around the tree lighting it up. One ignition point on the downwind side of the grass tree, and about where the green leaves meet the dead thatch, so that it burns down into the dead thatch. It's usually the best way to go, because if there's any animals in it, they can escape, and then the fire intensity won't build up too hot. The other thing to be careful is it seems to be, and we're still learning a lot about this, but it seems to be grass trees that are burnt in sort of like late autumn, early winter seem to recover a lot better than those that are burnt sort of later in spring and going into the summer. What's some other issues? So if you're burning it and you're putting water on it, you have to be careful that steam, or even if it's raining lightly when you're burning, you don't want steam on the apical bud killing the grass tree either. So it's just, a few things to keep in mind.
Awesome, thank you. I've got a question here. Karen, are you looking at ash depth when burning piles of debris to reduce fuel loads? Noticed that areas don't regenerate if the ash pile is a few inches deep, and wonder if this can impact natural regeneration.
No, we're not, and I don't know much about that. I do know there's some species that seem to only regenerate well in those deep ash beds, but it's so nuanced and complex, it could depend where in the landscape they are, if there's previous disturbance at that site. That could be a factor for sure, but I don't know much about that. Something to look out for.
Okay, I have a final question, I guess, for both of you. Can we have everything, like no ecological impact and managing our bushfire risk to an acceptable standard? Like, how do we find that balance?
I think it's going to be a compromise in some places. I think using the best knowledge that we have, we can make smart decisions so that we're not so that we can balance both. Sometimes it is win-win. Sometimes removing woody weeds from a bushland area reduces bushfire risk and it improves the ecology. Same with, encouraging glenda. But yeah, there will be times when, especially close to the houses, where you might need to compromise ecological values. Yeah. Do you want to jump in with something, Rohan?
No, just emphasise that there is obviously going to be a little bit more impact around the dwelling if you want to reduce fire behaviour near your home. So maybe there's opportunities for people to make site-specific decisions around their own place that they will accept. I don't know, higher levels of risk for better quality undisturbed native vegetation, and I don't have a sort of philosophical position on whether that's good or bad. It's if you understand your level of risk, you make informed decisions. That's really that's the most important thing, I think, too.
Yeah. Rohan, I actually had another question for you, if you don't mind turning your camera on to answer. So if you're, and Karen as well, jump in. I guess if you're doing all that work to clean up your place and have your fire-wise gardens to reduce your risk, and your neighbour, or if they're not cleaning up, and how do you have those conversations there to get sort of your neighbours on board with this fire management?
Yeah. Look, really can be a really challenging issue, and it's one where I think if you have good relationships with your neighbours, you might think about bushfire risk as a collective. There's certainly plenty of places in the Perth Hills where homes are closer together, and you may feel, I can't do enough on my property because I'm 5 metres off the fence or something like that. So look, the solutions are about, does the community come together and accept collective risk? That to me would be the right approach to try and take. Whether that's successful or not would come down to individual attitudes. It might come down to whether you want your local government to be involved. But communities are more resilient when people work together, and one thing I wanted to mention at the start of the session was we fully endorse, the Bushfire Ready group process that DFES have, because it's about people coming together to solve challenges and issues on a street-by-street basis. That's where they work best. They become communication networks to talk about fires in the landscape. What do you know? What do you know? And tell me about it. Where's it going? Am I under threat? And they become positive places where people might share equipment, and they might collectively work together for working bees once a week. So the ideal world won't always, or the ideal outcome won't always be achieved, but that's the best starting place, I think.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. Thanks for that. We've got another question from David. Rohan, you mentioned that the method to establish fuel loads is changing. Are you able to give us a brief summary on this?
David, I think what I was getting at is if you can reflect back to that slide where we had 3 different scale bushfires. What I was trying to discuss was the initial research, which informed the fire danger rating danger ratings and the fire danger indices. We're about to change tomorrow was based on litter fuels and litter fuels only. Now, big project called Project Vesta, which occurred around 2007, was the biggest research project in Australia that occurred in Western Australia that started to look at the structure of fuel loads. And so it looked at how does fire behave when there's elevated fuel loads and there's connectivity or ladder fuels. So that was really important piece of work. And the other bit of research, I think, which is starting to be discussed more at conferences is probably the effect of the fire weather on the behaviour. We're tending to see for low intensity fires, they are driven by the fuel load. But when the fire weather starts to get excessive or past our old scale of 50 on the fire danger indice, they start to be weather driven bushfire events. You might have heard of this is what's being discussed after the Black Summer in New South Wales by the fire chiefs. It's what's being discussed after these very large fires, that the energy the weather system puts in does negate the fuel quantity in the landscape. And if we go to the extreme of fire behaviour, we can have pyrocumulonimbus clouds that start dry lightning ahead, and there's new ignition. So weather-driven systems are difficult. If we prescribe burn the lower levels, the litter and the lower levels of shrub fuels, how much impact are we having on those big weather-driven bushfire events, which are the most difficult for us to deal with? So that's sort of the concept I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks for that, Rohan. So if there, yep, thank you. So if there's no more questions, we might wrap it up there because we covered a lot of content. So I'd really like to thank Dr. Karen Brown and Rohan Carboon for joining us today over lunchtime. It was very insightful, and we have a lot of practical tips that we can all take away from this and start implementing and have more of an understanding of the relationship that our native flora has with fires and factors that are considered with ecological burning. So really appreciate your time today. I would also like to thank Perth NRM Comms and my colleague Ingrid Seeler and the Shire of Mundaring, who always work together awesomely behind the scenes to help pull these webinars together. So thanks, guys. As mentioned, this webinar is recorded, so will be uploaded to our website for future reference. And so this is our second last webinar. Our last one of these will be in a few weeks' time with a focus on biodiversity. So I think we've penciled in the 29th of September for that one, but we'll send out all the information for that one once we have more details. So with that, I think that brings us to the end. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.